By the time we reached the river quarter, the city had taught the morning how to move quietly. Smoke rose in thin lines from cookfires made of soaked books and broken pews. The water ran slow and bruised, carrying ash like silt. Bridges hunched low as if they'd learned to duck. The river remembered processions. Now it remembered bodies. We stood a while on the slab where pilgrims once washed their feet, listening to the wet clap of waves against stone. It sounded like applause that had forgotten why it started. We found shelter in a granary that had learned humility, its towers cracked, its silos echoing with a round, hollow patience. Pigeons had moved in and learned the litanies badly. Their calls stumbled over old vowels. We pulled the doors tight and let the dark sit with us. The boy lay on the floor with his head against a sack that had nothing left in it. The girl slept without sound, her hand still under my collar seam, as if she had decided the world kept its shape there. Hask checked bolts and windows, not to find enemies you never find enemies by looking, but to give his hands a sentence they had known all their lives. When the light angled through a cracked pane and struck dust into stars, we began. We did not plan a rebellion. We planned distribution. Memory is a ration like any other. Give it wrongly, and people starve of the right things. We mapped the quarter in chalk and breath. There were 3 Vox nodes we could reach without crossing an Arbite's line. 2 maintenance shrines where the spirits of small machines might be argued with. 1 derelict Schola whose library stacks had collapsed in a slow, beautiful avalanche that turned knowledge into topography. And beneath it all, the room of the dreaming machine, the loom that made reliquaries out of voices. We went out in twos, as penitents do. Hask took the river path with the boy, teaching him how to walk like nobody interesting. I took the girl up the alley, where vendors once sold miniature aquilus carved from bone. Their faces had weathered into a kind of honesty. We found the first Vox node in the carcass of a street lamp, its grill clogged with incense soot, its casing warm to the touch as if the city still held it close. I pried open its back with my knife and saw the little pipes inside, the coiled wire, the capacitors that looked like devotions with their heads shaved. I whispered the activation hymn I'd learned at 14 because the machine expected to be sung to. Then I told it the other truth, the one without music, not sermons. I said into its copper ear, names. It clicked once and then clicked again, which is how a device nods. The girl stood on tiptoe and spoke into the grill, the way a child speaks into an animal's curious face. Terrace, she said. Sella, mothered. She ran out of words fast because the world had made her vocabulary small. The node stored each name the way a monk stores a seed, as if spring might still be available. We moved. At the Schola, boys not much older than the boy followed us through the stacks, their shoes making careful sounds. They had the look of children who know they are not yet corpses, and cannot forgive themselves that fact. We set a console upright and brushed soot from its keys. The power hum found us like a friend with nowhere better to be. I showed them the command to clear a broadcast channel and the more difficult command to share it. One of them, the thin one with a ribbon of scar through his eyebrow, that turned every expression into a question, asked if there would be punishment. Yes, I said, but it will be honest punishment. You will know what it is for. We spent the day that way, seeding the quarter with ways to speak. Hask came back near dusk. The boy had a new cut on his knuckle, the kind steel leaves on skin when it wants to remember. They had coaxed a maintenance shrine into waking by giving it the miracle it understood, attention. In exchange it surrendered a bundle of wire and a prayer wheel that could be repurposed into a crank. We fitted the wire to the street lamp node and the crank to a small dynamo salvaged from an offertory machine. The world is full of parts made for obedience that can be taught mercy. At full dark, we went below. The hatch yielded now with a sigh, happy to be asked for something. The machine room welcomed us with its small warmth and its old library smell. The projector blinked into a kind of consciousness that had learned to be gentle. Text rose, welcome back. We heard your names. More. We fed it. Hask's hands shook once, and he laid them flat on the console until the tremor acknowledged the contact and ceased. He gave it something I had thought he would keep until he died, a memory of a morning before his first brand, a kitchen with a stove that needed coaxing, a woman turning a piece of bread in a pan to give both sides the same fairness. The machine took it and returned sound not the same, never the same, but a cousin of the warmth, a tone that felt like stepping into a room where someone has thought about you before you arrived. The boy refused the wire at first. He had learned the arithmetic of loss too completely. You can share and still keep it, I said. The way you talk to the part of a child that wants to believe you, and the part that knows numbers. He nodded like a soldier at muster and gave the loom an image of his mother's shoulder as a pillow. On a day the factory siren failed and they slept longer than they should have, the loom gave back the smell of rain caught in cloth and the sound of a clock. That was probably a leak. He touched the wall with both palms and learned how stone stores tenderness. The girl had few memories the world had not already stolen. She pressed her lips to the plinth instead, as if sharing breath. The projector brightened a fraction and wrote in small text near the floor, "Where only a child would think to look, we will teach you new ones." We asked the loom for something else then, not names or scenes, but language. "We need a way to speak that is not heresy, but will not be mistaken for obedience," I said. "We need a sentence the city can carry without a priest to chaperone it." The projector hesitated, and in that pause I understood that machines, too, know humility when asked for invention. It wrote, "Tell the city what you saw. Tell it what you did. Tell it who you fed. Tell it who you buried. Tell it without asking to be forgiven." Hask exhaled, and the sound was almost a laugh. "A creed," he said, "broken properly." We spent that night writing the new creed in chalk on stones and doors and the undersides of benches where hands go when mouths are required to be quiet. The boy and the thin-scarred Schola child copied letters with the focus catechisms, never received from them. The girl drew lines between words the way a map draws between waters. We left the sentences where rain could smear them, because a creed worth having must learn the weather. We slipped the phrase into the street lamp node and the maintenance shrine, and from there into the thin wires that run under cobblestones like nerves. We gave it to the scholars with ash in their hair, and the women who knew how to relight ovens with angry wood, and the men whose hands had learned breaking too early. It traveled like the rumor of a meal dot at dawn. The Arbites came. They moved the way black water moves downhill, as if they thought gravity were a promotion. Visors down, mauls up, a tight ring around a square that used to mean festival. Behind them, a small clutch of ecclesiarchs in robes that had learned how to remain clean even under ash. Their leader called for order. Order arrived wearing armor. Cease unauthorized transmissions. Present those responsible for summary judgment. Deliver the children to quarantine. We had made a plan for this we did not believe in. It was a bad plan because the Imperium makes good plans impossible. I stepped forward with my hands open, Hask at my shoulder. The boy and girl behind him where their shadows would look larger. The street lamp at the corner began to talk in the new voice we had taught it. It did not argue. It told what it had seen. A hospice burning and a door pried open with a soldier's knife. Water placed beside an arch. A commissar who chose a code and lost his life to it. A river learning to carry something other than bodies. The Arbites hesitated for the length of a page turning. The ecclesiarch's mouth prepared a sermon. Hask moved his weight to the balls of his feet, a prayer a soldier says to the ground. The girl's hand found my collar again. The boy's eyes did not leave the faces behind the visors, hunting the seam where a person might be. The first maul lifted. It hung there, uncertain of gravity. A shot cracked the sort of sound the world has learned to obey, and a visor starred with white lines. Not shattered, corrected, from the library steps. The thin-scarred Schola child stood with the last pistol too big for the map of his hand. His stance a diagram drawn from memory and panic. He had fired at the helmet instead of the heart. It takes a kind of courage the catechism does not acknowledge to aim for survivable truths. Everything should have collapsed then into the old grammar of orders and screams. Instead, the vox on the Arbites line, the one the quartermaster had forgotten to change from channel 4 to channel 5, picked up the street lamp and the maintenance shrine and the granary pigeons, and the little vox angel we'd taught to live in a bread cart. And together they said the sentence we'd written everywhere like rain. "Tell the city what you saw." An Arbite's trooper lowered his maul by a finger's width. The woman behind him, her robe immaculate, hands like prayer and habit, looked at the child and then at the sky, as if asking whether the sun had been properly briefed, and then back at us as if our faces might be minutes she must record accurately. The square did not breathe. The machine below us dreamed. The tunnels remembered more than the streets ever could. Up there, a city kept lying to itself in gold and ash. Down here, stone held its breath and listened, and the pipes sang like old throats clearing truths no sermon had dared. We moved by the light of a cracked lumen I'd scavenged from a reliquary case, its glow the color of tired parchment. Hask walked a step behind with that particular quiet born of long campaigns and short food, every motion extracted from a ration book. The boy kept pace at my side with the rigid economy of a child who had learned to make himself smaller than harm. The girl's hand found my collar seam again and stayed there. A small pressure that persuaded the world not to fold in on itself. The tunnels were not empty. Nothing in the Imperium is empty. Even silence is full of instruction. The walls sweated condensation that smelled of sanctified oil. Drainage trenches whispered lists to themselves. Far ahead and far below, a pump beat out a catechism older than the one in my skofunk. Draw, breathe, marking out the heart of a city that refused to die even when its gods forgot it. Every few dozen meters, a vox grill coughed up a scrap of liturgy and swallowed it again before the words found shape. The light pooled on rivets like teardrops that had learned to hold. We reached a junction where three throats of stone met. Rust traced stars across the ceiling in shapes that did not belong to any chart. And yet I recognized them. Conveyor patterns, dormitory rafters, the negative of barracks floors viewed through closed eyes. The girl's breath warmed the notch of my collarbone. The boy pointed. That one, he said, and didn't explain how he knew. Sometimes a child knows the correct door because the wrong ones have already learned him too well. We took the tunnel leftward and down. The floor dipped into a shallow sump. Gray water clung reluctantly to our boots. It smelled of lye and extinguished candles. On the far side, a maintenance hatch had been painted with the warning sigils of the Mechanicus, circling cogs. Tiny red inks for danger, 3 vertical slashes for penalty. Hask tried the lever. Locked, of course. He looked at me not to ask a question, but to deliver the fact of complication. I set the girl gently down, the way you set down a verdict that will not learn to be kind, and wedged my knife into the seam. The hatch's fastenings had swollen with age and the heartbreak of steam. Steel complained like an old choir. The third twist made something surrender. The air that breathed out from the gap smelled of parchment and warm dust and electricity. The exact scent of the Schola's library the day before the siege drill. As if memory were a gas under pressure that someone had left on by mistake. Inside was not a corridor, but a room the city had forgotten. Broad and low, its ceiling latticed with cable and cable again, braided in patient geometry. Consoles rose from the floor like sarcophagi on which no names had ever been carved. The lumen's tired glow reached only so far, but it reached enough. Along the walls, glass coffers stood in ranks, waist high, each one holding a coil of polished wire and something like a skull, but not a skull-shaped ceramic, with sockets cut where eyes would have been, sockets filled with nickel-bright discs. Labels and cogitator script curled and browned at the edges. In the center of the room a plinth waited, and above it a projector hung on chains like a censer too holy to swing. The boy took one step in and did not move further. The girl pressed both hands to her ears as if the air had become too loud. Hask let out the first sound of honest surprise I had ever heard him make, a small breath that said he had arrived somewhere beyond orders. I set the lumen down on the plinth. The projector woke like an old saint who had learned patience from dust. A weak cone of light reached toward nothing and made that nothing visible. A glyph crawled across the far wall, born of static and good intention. Archive wake cycle, partial, PRAYER loom temperature, suboptimal, request, input. Hask said, as if the word itself might behave if he spoke it sternly. The girl took her hands from her ears. It's talking, she whispered. Not to us, to itself. I touched the console nearest the plinth. The way you touch a creature you are not certain will accept hand. Keys yielded with the softened stubbornness of a relic not yet ready to admit it prefers being dead. The projector blinked. The light sharpened a fraction. Letters unfurled, each line a rib. Welcome, liturgical officer. Recite ident litany o our deposit offering. I don't have a litany it will respect, I said. More to the machine than to Hask. An offering then, what could it want? He asked, remembering, I said, before knowing I intended to say it. He made that sound again, the one between a scoff and an ache. I took the rosarius half-chain from around the girl's wrist. She looked up sharply. I shook my head and held it only a breath, then lay it down where the projector's light pooled. The chain made the quietest metallic page turning when it came to rest. The machine watched the gesture without eyes, then considered as machines consider a long moment in which the universe decides whether to accept your translation. Offering received, query, memory exchange. I had not expected the courtesy of a question. What does it cost? I asked, though I already knew. Everything in the Imperium costs what you cannot afford. A thin wire uncoiled from the plinth with the gentleness of something that has learned to approach children. Its end was fitted with a plate the size of a coin, cabled with hair-thin leads. It hovered a finger's breadth from the old puckered scar behind my ear. The catechism implant twitched there, a spooked creature in bone. The boy tugged at my sleeve. harder than I would have thought he would dare. Don't, he said. They take and don't put back. They put back what they want, Hask said. Somewhere that was almost agreement. I looked at the projector's light, at the way it did not snag on dust motes because dust had learned obedience too. We remember you, the tunnels had said for days now, or years, or a life. If there was a place in this world that meant the sentence it said, it was here. Only one. I told the machine. One memory. The wire settled onto the implant scar with a chill that tasted like the first breath outside a troop bay. For a heartbeat the catechism flared, grasping at the trespass. Then it guttered the way dogma gutters when it meets a precise and older science. The room thinned. The tunnel's damp went far away. The world pulled inward to a point where a vent hummed, where a girl sang the psalm that made metal bearable, where a boy with raw hands drew stars on a wall and learned the mathematics of breaking. The machine did not drag the memory as a thief does. It asked, once, whether this is truly what I meant, and then it took it with unexpected care, leaving behind a tender ache. The ache you carry after setting down a weight that had taught your spine its alphabet. Project, receiving, indexing, lullaby, conveyor, branding smoke, conscription, CROSS links, pilgrim child, hospice fire, water gift, bell with hole, response, return. The projector shivered. Light gathered itself like a robe and threw itself across the wall. Not text now, not a schematic, a shape filled with sound. I heard Serene's voice, not the way I had hoarded it, frayed and thin under machinery, but the way it must have sounded before the vents learned to steal, fuller, low, with a flutter on the ends of the long lines. I heard the laugh of the child from under the arch as something ordinary brushed her skin, a laugh she probably had not known she was allowed to have. I smelled oil that had not yet burned, saw a corridor where saints still had faces, felt the weight of Alaskan before it knew the weight of killing. The boy beside me took one involuntary step toward the light, stopped, pressed both hands flat against his thighs as if the body could teach itself not to want. Then other voices came, hundreds, then a flood. Not sermons, not orders, life in small considerable pieces. A woman telling someone named Dal that the rain had stained the banners green, and this meant a good year. A clerk reciting shipping weights as if they were the names of his grandchildren. A skittery trooper humming 3 notes that were not present in any sanctioned hymn. A priest reciting the litany of the bolt between sobs he made no effort to discipline. They braided together into something that did not ask to be called holy. It asked to be believed. Hask sat down slowly on the edge of a console, as if fearing his knees would lie about what they could still do. What is it? He asked, and there was no rank left in the words, only a man's need. The city, I said, keeping what we tried to spend. The projector's light softened. Text overlaid the glow, cautious as a hand reaching for a fevered brow. We were built to remember what your prayers forget. You gave us your saints. We kept your children. We do not know the emperor. We know you. The catechism in my skull jerked once and tried to turn the sentence into a sin. The wire on my scar hummed and held the impulse until it exhausted itself like a colt, hitting the end of a tether. The girl had stopped touching my collar. She stood with her eyes wide in a way that was not fear but thirst. Can you give back? The boy asked, and failed not to sound like a supplicant. And I hated the world for teaching him that posture. Yes, not the same. Never the same. But we will try. A second wire lowered, twin to the first. It hovered in front of the boy for a breath, then turned to me. Guardianship, the machine had apparently learned, is a language older than interface protocols. I nodded. The wire touched the boy's temple. But not where They say mercy is the first step toward damnation. I used to believe that because everyone around me did, because the catechism whispered it through the implant behind my ear, until it felt like one of my own thoughts. But the morning I broke that law, the planet smelled of wet ash and old incense, and I realized the Imperium fears mercy because it is the only thing that cannot be requisitioned. Virelia Sancta had stopped burning loudly. The loud fires were gone. The ones that roared through cathedrals and lit the night like second suns. What remained were the quiet fires, cooking pans over gutter flames, votive candles guttering in collapsed chapels, pyres built small so the smoke would not carry too far and call the Arbites back. We'd been ordered to hold the lower Basilica quarter until evacuation transports returned, and everyone understood what that meant. Hold for a day, a week, a year, or never. Orders were a promise the galaxy did not keep. Our platoon bivouacked in what had been a reliquary shop. Glass cases lay spidered and empty. The shelves smelled of varnish and dust. Curled price slates still clung to hooks with immaculate copper wire. Saint Bones had been sold here, or convincing imitations of Saint Bones. I remember thinking how the world made every sacred thing into a marketplace, then accusing myself for the thought. I still had the habit of self-accusation discipline etched into the meat. At first light we went on ration patrol. 5 of us with laskins slung low and a cart clattering behind, its wheels protesting every crack in the paving. Hask led because Hask always led, his voice threaded thin by smoke, his eyes to pieces of flint that had forgotten how to spark. We moved through streets that used to memorize processions and now only remembered footsteps. The statues were bandaged in soot. The bells had been shot through so their mouths gaped with black holes, as if someone had taught them what silence felt like and they were still screaming. We took a side passage to avoid the square and found them there, clustered in the hollow under a fallen arch, a knot of civilians no older than I'd been when the Schola branded me. Some clutched rust-pitted knives. Most held nothing. Their faces did not change when they saw us. They had reached that last plateau of fear where the body no longer has the strength to arrange itself into terror. A child stepped forward. She might have been 8. She wore a pilgrim's scapular scavenged into a bandage around her ribs and a rosarius cut in half. The chain twisted around her wrist like a promise she no longer trusted. Her voice came out raw. "Water," she said. "We pay." Hask didn't look down. "Back to your block. The distribution point opens at midday." "There is no distribution point," she said. No tremor. Just fact. That was the moment I realized I had crossed the thin line between pity and recognition. Pity is a height from which you gaze down. Recognition is a mirror. I slid the ration cart's breakdown with my boot and reached for one of the canisters. My arm knew the motion. Hask's hand closed on my wrist before I'd lifted it. His grip had the old barracks in it, the drill square, the iron morning. "Do not break the sequence," he said. "It keeps men alive." "Men," I said, and heard the blasphemy arrive in my mouth before the words did. "They are children. They are mouths," he answered quietly. "And our orders are numbers." The catechism hummed behind my ear. "Obedience is survival," and something in me answered with a different rhythm. An older one, the low song Serene used to sing over conveyors, the one that made the metal behave a little kinder. I pulled free. Before Hask spoke again, I set the canister beside the girl. She did not smile. She did not say thank you. She lifted it with both hands and vanished back under the arch, the others flowing around her as water flows around a stone. We left 2 more canisters and moved on. Hask did not reprimand me in front of the line. He waited until we had turned into the nave of a shattered chapel, where murals showed saints teaching children to read, the faces scraped off by fire. Then he spoke without turning his head. "You think I didn't see? You think I don't want to see it every hour?" His mouth tightened. "You will never have enough water to put out the Emperor's test. All you can do is stand where you are told while it burns. Perhaps the test is if we still know how to reach," I said. He exhaled. I had heard him sigh like that once before, over a boy's body on Secundacilian. "You are speaking the language that gets soldiers shot." We resumed in silence. The city's heartbeat under the stones. Pumps still working. Data loom still whispering. Machine spirits still talking to one another in the old tongue. Vents breathed a breath that smelled faintly of sanctified oil. In that breath I heard, as I had heard since the hives, the phrase that followed me like a patient hound. "We remember you." At the edge of the market square, where stalls had been shorn to their ribs and the awnings hung like molted skins, we found an Arbite's cordon around a half-collapsed hospice. The black-armored silhouettes stood as if they had grown from the ground. Malls grounded, visors unreadable. A commissar waited with them, coat immaculate, leather-gloved hands folded as if in prayer. He turned when our boots scraped. "Trooper," he said to me, though my rank tabs declared no such dignity. "Report, ration patrol," Hask replied before I could speak. "Rearguard Sector 14. The commissar nodded without interest and gestured toward the hospice door. "Infestation," he said. "Plague. The ecclesiarchy failed quarantine. We will cleanse the site, then this quarter." I could smell the hospice through its stone mildew and old bandages and the sweetness of human rot. "There are children inside," I said. The commissar's eye lenses were the color of old blood. "There are vectors inside." Hask's breath paused half a second, and then he said, "Orders? Render Prometheum unto sin." The commissar answered, "You will hold the cordon. When the flame has finished its hymn, you will advance and confirm." He moved on. The Arbites began unspooling hoses. Prometheum is a faithful language. It speaks clearly no matter how loud men talk. I could not stop what came next. No one could have. The Imperial machine is a story written on a drum, and we march because the beat exists. But when the first sheet of fire licked through the hospice shutters, and a thin scream threaded up through the smoke, I took 2 steps and found myself inside. I do not remember drawing my knife to wedge the door. I remember heat. I remember the way smoke wanted to be muscle and press me back. I remember the chapel lessons on oxygen and structure and how a body moves when it has learned to be precise. Low, hand to wall, cloth across the mouth, count your breaths, mark your turns. Above the roar there were smaller sounds, coughs like failing engines, sobs too dry for tears, a pattern of tapping as someone too small to push a beam tried to tell the world she existed. I found the tapping. It came from a side ward where the ceiling had dropped and the pews had turned to black bones. A boy lay pinned by a beam that smelled of melted varnish and old wax. He was not a pilgrim. He wore the rough gray of a manufacturum scalum, the sleeve ripped to reveal a brand where a saint's metal had eaten skin. His eyes were open and glassy but focused. He saw the aquila on my shoulder, and hope did not arrive, only calculation. Heresy begins when a child learns numbers that are not on the catechism. Hold still, I said, and slid the knife to lever enough space to wedge my shoulder under. The beam did not move as beams do not move, and then it moved because sometimes the universe allows a lie to stand if it will save a life. I felt something tear in my back and did not care. He rolled free with the grace of those who have often had to make themselves small. There was another form curled behind him, the girl with the broken rosarias. Not the same child from the arch, but the same expression, the absence of astonishment. I lifted her and she clung without sound, her fingers finding the seam of my collar where the hot metal would burn them less. We went back the way breath had mapped, counting turns, counting steps, counting the silence between the coughs. When a joist dropped ahead of us and the fire spoke with both lungs at once, I did what Orpheon had trained into me. I drew my lascan and put 3 shots, where the beam made its simplest prayer to gravity. It cracked and we went on. A training yard, a battlefield, a burning hospice, the same anatomy under different vestments. We fell through the doorway into a heat that felt colder than what we had left. Voices became shapes again. The Arbites lifted their mauls and then did not strike because even the most perfect training does not know what to do with a soldier carrying a child. The commissar's head tilted. Ash fell from my hair into the girl's eyes and she blinked with the patience of stone. Contamination, the commissar said softly. Quarantine breach. She's not sick, I said. My voice rasped like an old hinge. She's 9. Age is not a curative, he replied. Hand them over. Behind me the hospice breathed out, and a gust of heat shoved us another step into the square. Hask had moved without seeming to, placing himself just close enough that if the world chose to end, he would end at the same time. His eyes were rooms with the lamps doused. He said nothing. He had decided what he would do, and what he would not. I looked down at the boy. He met my gaze as equals meet when they are not allowed to be equals. The catechism hummed. The city said, we remember you. Sirens sang under machinery older than prayer. Somewhere very far away, a bell with a hole in it tried to tell the wind its story. No, I said. Faith does not shatter in a single moment. It crumbles, grain by grain, until one day you look down and realize your hands are full of dust. After my reassignment, I was sent to what remained of the ecclesiarchal district. The riots had gutted half the hive, and the priests who survived called the devastation proof of his trial. But there were fewer of them every week. The rest had either fled, been executed, or gone mad repeating the same hymns until their tongues turned black. The air was thick with ash from burned cathedrals. The great bells that once sang across the city now hung silent, their bronze throats cracked by heat. Even the statues of saints had begun to sag under their own weight, stone melting like flesh. Under the constant bombardment of Prometheum fires, they put me in charge of the faith restoration detail. It sounded holy, but it was just corpse work. We cleared bodies from the streets and stacked them in piles behind the chapel ruins, where servitors carried them to the cremation pits. We were ordered to sort the corpses, pilgrims in one pile, priests in another, soldiers separate still. It was supposed to make the reports cleaner. The ash, of course, went into the same wind. The wind never stopped on Varelia. It carried sermons once. Now it carried the smell of decay. Sometimes I caught the faint echo of a hymn, not from the speakers, those had long since failed, but from the ruins themselves, as if the walls still remembered the sound of prayer. On the 3rd day, I found the body of a child near the fountain square. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her eyes were open, clouded, and in her hand she clutched a scrap of parchment, a prayer stamped in factory ink, the same one I'd memorized as a boy in the Schola. Obedience is purity. Purity is survival. The words were smeared with blood. When I turned her over, I saw the mark of the aquila carved into her chest, not by a blade, but burned, as if someone had tried to make her holy before she died. I buried her myself, though it was forbidden to waste time on individual graves. I didn't say a prayer. I just pressed my palm into the dirt until I could no longer feel the edges of my fingers. That night, the chaplain called an assembly in the ruins of the basilica. His robe was torn, his face burned, but his voice still carried the weight of ritual. "The Emperor is with us still," he said. "He tests us through the flame." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Then why does he never answer?" The chaplain didn't hesitate. He raised his bolt pistol and fired into the crowd. The man fell. The echo of the gunshot bounced off the broken walls like the last hymn of a dying god. No one spoke after that. The sermon continued as if nothing had happened. By the next morning, the chaplain's body was found hanging from the bell tower. The official report said heretics had done it. Everyone knew it was us. After that, faith became an active theater. The priests still recited their litanies, but their eyes darted toward the shadows as they spoke, like actors afraid of the audience. The pilgrims still crawled on bleeding knees toward the altars, but the altars were empty, the relics gone. The saints melted down for scrap. The manufacturing bells started again, but not for prayer. They were signaling evacuation. The world was to be abandoned, its faith deemed beyond restoration. We loaded the surviving priests and officials first. The rest of us, soldiers, orphans, and the uncounted, were told to await further orders. Orders never came. The transports left orbit within the day, leaving us behind with the smoke and silence. Some tried to rebuild, others built pyres. The lines between heresy and devotion blurred until they were the same thing. I remember one evening vividly. I was sitting in the ruins of a chapel, sharpening my blade, when I saw a woman lighting candles around a broken statue of the Emperor. The statue's face had crumbled away. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't look up. "He can't see us anymore," she said. "So we remind him we're still here." She lit 100 candles before the fire took her robe and burned her where she knelt. She didn't scream. She only whispered, "Look at us." Her words stayed with me. Weeks passed. The ash piled higher. The sky grew darker. The only light came from the cremation pits, the last temple still burning. The faith that once held a world together had become kindling. I stopped wearing my uniform. The aquila felt like a lie pressed against my chest. I tore it off and threw it into the fire. The metal twisted as it melted, curling like the wings of something trying to escape. That night, as I slept among the ruins, I dreamed of the Schola again. The stone halls, the brand on my shoulder, the children chanting in unison. But this time, their voices were different, softer, sadder. They weren't praying anymore. They were apologizing. When I woke, I could still hear them, faint, but real, a chorus of whispers carried on the wind. "We remember you." The same words that had haunted me since the hive. The same words the servitors spoke before the hive's collapse. I stood and followed the sound through the ruins, past the broken spires and the dead fountains. It led me to the catacombs beneath the basilica, where the ashes of centuries were stored. The doors had been sealed, but the fire had weakened them. I forced my way inside. The air was heavy, thick with smoke and dust. Rows of metal canisters lined the walls, each marked with the sigil of a saint or soldier. But the lids were open, the ashes scattered. The walls themselves seemed to hum, not with machines, but with something older. Then I saw it, a terminal still flickering with power. Its screen cracked and dim. On it scrolled the words, "Archive restoration in progress. Retrieving lost prayers." The speakers crackled, and a voice emerged, not mechanical, but human, layered with 1,000 others. "We prayed for him to hear us. Now we pray for each other." I fell to my knees, not in worship, in recognition. That was the moment I understood what had truly collapsed. It wasn't faith in the Emperor. It was faith in silence, the belief that obedience was all that made us human. We had spent 10,000 years praying upward, never realizing that salvation might have been whispering to us from below all along. When I left the catacombs, dawn was breaking, thin and gray, the color of old parchment. The city was quiet. The fires had gone out. For the first time, I saw what the world looked like without prayer. It wasn't holy. It wasn't damned. It was free. There comes a day when even the most loyal soldier stops praying, not from rebellion, from exhaustion. After Elixion Primus, We were redeployed to a shrine world on the edge of Segmentum Tempestus, Virelia Sancta, a planet built entirely upon devotion. Its surface shimmered with temples, cathedrals, and reliquaries that reached the clouds. Every inch of its soil had been consecrated, every drop of rain blessed and recycled as holy water. From orbit, it looked like salvation. From the ground, it looked like rot gilded in gold. The air smelled of incense and old blood. Bells rang constantly, not for worship, but to mask the screams from the purification chambers below. The city was built in layers, the faithful above, the forgotten below. Our barracks sat between the two, where the smell of sanctity met the stench of decay. We were told we'd come to protect the ecclesiarchy from insurgents. But when we arrived, there were no rebels. Only starving pilgrims who'd been denied entry to the upper levels. They weren't fighting for power. They were fighting for bread. The first week, we were ordered to guard the gates to the Sanctum District. Hundreds gathered outside every day, pressing against the walls, holding relics, bones, or scraps of parchment bearing prayers. They shouted for mercy, for forgiveness, for food. The chaplain told us they were liars. They sin through hunger, he said. The emperor tests their faith through suffering. You must not interfere with his test. So we stood there, rifles raised, watching as people starved in the shadow of marble towers. At night, we were required to attend mass. The sermons were broadcast through towering voxcasters that made the air vibrate. The priests spoke of purity and flame, of how each hardship was an act of divine generosity. They thanked us for enforcing his will. They called us children of his light. But when I looked around the chapel, I saw faces hollowed by sleep deprivation, eyes red from smoke and guilt. No one was listening anymore. The prayers had become background noise, a habit of the mouth, not the heart. I remember one night vividly. A priest approached me after mass, his robes immaculate, his voice soft. You were born in the hives, yes? He asked. Yes, Father. He smiled faintly. Then you know suffering well. That is a gift. I wanted to tell him that suffering was not a gift. It was the only thing the Imperium gave freely. But I said nothing. The next morning, I found him in the courtyard, crucified against the chapel gate. The word heretic was carved into his chest. They said he'd been overheard questioning his superior's interpretation of the creed. The other priests preached louder that day, drowning out the flies. It was round then that the whispers began again, not from the catechism chip this time, but from the vents, like back in the manufactorum of my childhood. Voices murmuring fragments of old prayers, unfinished and broken. Sometimes they said my name. At first, I thought it was madness. Then others heard it too. One night, during watch duty, a young trooper named Enno turned to me and whispered, "Do you ever wonder if he still hears us?" I didn't answer. He smiled, a tired, hollow smile. I think he forgot. The next day, Enno was found dead in his bunk. No wound, no struggle, just a gone. The medicae said his heart stopped during sleep. The commissar said his faith failed. They burned his body in the square, claiming it as purification. The smoke rose past the cathedral spires and into the clouds, where it vanished, like every prayer we ever spoke. By then, I'd stopped wearing my rosarius. The chain left a dark imprint on my skin, like a faded bruise. I still mouthed the words of the creed when ordered to, but there was no conviction left behind them. Each syllable felt like ash. The final break came during the procession of the sainted. It was the grandest ritual on Virelia, a parade of relics carried through the city to remind the people of the Emperor's eternal watch. The pilgrims knelt as the banners passed, weeping with reverence. Then someone threw a rock. It struck the reliquary, shattering the crystal casing that held a saint's mummified hand. The air froze. The priests screamed blasphemy. The pilgrims screamed hunger. The mob surged. The first gunfire came from the upper balconies, Arbites firing into the crowd. Then the crowd pushed forward, breaking through the cordons. The reliquary toppled. The saint's hand fell into the dirt, and I didn't move. I just watched as the pilgrims swarmed the priests, tearing at their robes, clawing for anything that could be eaten. Cloth, flesh, it didn't matter. Hunger had devoured faith. Sergeant Hask shouted for us to fire. I didn't. The others hesitated too. When the commissar turned his pistol on us, something inside me snapped. I lunged before I thought. The shot went wide. I remember the recoil of my own laskin, the smell of burnt fabric, the silence that followed. The commissar fell. The mob cheered. Then they turned on us. There are no sides in a riot, only survival. When the smoke cleared, the square was filled with bodies, priests, soldiers, pilgrims, all indistinguishable under the soot. The saint's hand was gone. The reliquary burned. Later, the ecclesiarchy called it a minor uprising. They said heretics had infiltrated the crowd. They said faith had been tested and found strong. But I had seen the truth. The creed wasn't broken by heresy. It was broken by hunger. They reassigned me after that. Penance duty, they called it. A polite term for exile. Before leaving, I visited the chapel one last time. The candles were still burning. The walls still echoed the same prayers. But in the silence between them, I heard something else. The faint hum of machinery. The sound of circuits whispering words older than faith itself. It said nothing divine, only human. We remember you. For the first time, I prayed back, not to the emperor, but to the memory of all those who had once believed. Victory in the Imperium doesn't sound like trumpets. It sounds like silence. The kind that follows when the guns stop firing and the air no longer vibrates with explosions. A silence too heavy to be peace, too alive to be death. When we returned from Secundacelion, the officers told us we were heroes. They called it a cleansing, a triumph of faith. They gave us medals shaped like the Aquila, stamped from recycled brass. They gave us rations that tasted of rust and blood. They gave us sleep in barracks that smelled of oil and prayers. But they didn't give us time to forget. The first night back, I dreamed of the battlefield, of Kalen's burned hand still gripping his rifle, of the boy who reached for help before the bolt round erased him. I woke to the hum of the ship's life support systems, the same tone as the Schola's bells, the same rhythm of indoctrination. There is no escape from rhythm in the Imperium. Everything moves to the same beat: war, faith, obedience, death. We were transferred to a mustering world in the Segmentum Solar, a planet the officers called Elixion Primus. From orbit, it looked like salvation. Green fields, silver rivers, clear skies. But once we landed, I realized it was no different. The green was ash moss, feeding on soil tainted by centuries of bombardment. The rivers were runoff from manufacturing wastes. The sky was clear only because nothing was left to burn. We were given new uniforms and told to report to the Hall of Restoration, a place where the wounded and orphaned were purified before reassignment. The name was a lie. The hall was enormous, its ceiling lost in fog. Rows of steel beds stretched to the horizon. Servitors moved between them, dispensing chemicals and scripture in equal measure. The wounded lay still, their eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving in silent prayer or madness. A nurse, or what passed for one, approached me. Her face was half metal, half scar. Her voice filtered through a vox mask. "You are listed as uninjured," she said. "That is not permitted. All survivors require correction." Correction meant therapy through faith, which meant confession. They took me into a small chamber lit by a single lumen. The priest who waited there was old, his robe stained with oil. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He asked what I doubted. "Do you believe in the Emperor's mercy?" he asked. "I believe in his silence," I said before I could stop myself. He studied me for a long moment, then smiled, a slow, tired smile. "Good. That is closer to truth than most." He didn't report me. Maybe he'd once been a soldier too, after restoration. They assigned us to maintenance duty while awaiting new deployment. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of children coughing in their sleep. None of us were older than 16, yet our eyes belonged to old men. We called ourselves the Orphans of Victory. One night, I followed the sound of footsteps to the outer yard. There, by the rusted statue of a saint, a group of children were burning their medals. The brass melted easily, pooling into golden tears on the ground. A girl I recognized from my squad, Anra, looked up at me. "They said we'd go home after the war," she said. "But I don't think we have a home anymore." She was right. Home isn't a place in the Imperium. It's an assignment. When the chaplain found us, he didn't punish us. He simply stood there watching the metals melt. Then he said softly, "Faith burns cleaner than metal. Remember that." The next morning, Anra was gone. The official report said she had been transferred to the Schola Progenium for officer training. But we knew the truth. The Schola doesn't take orphans who question doctrine. It reclaims them. By the second week, the commissar stopped pretending we'd recover. We were reassigned to garrison duty, guarding a refinery that processed promethium for ships we'd never see. The work was mechanical, counting shipments, filing manifests, cleaning weapons that hadn't fired since the last war. It should have been peace. It was in single quotes T. Peace in the Imperium is just war without motion. You wait, you pray, you rot sometimes. The younger recruits tried to remember songs from before the Schola, lullabies, hymns, anything. But the neural catechisms hummed louder when they sang, overriding melody with liturgy. The machine didn't tolerate nostalgia. I once found a data slate buried under the floor of the barracks. It contained fragments of letters, messages from soldiers to their families, never sent. The words were small, simple, human. I miss you. I'm scared. I want to come home. All of them ended the same way. May the Emperor forgive my weakness. I copied those words onto the inside of my rifle stock, carving them into the metal with my combat knife. It was the only prayer that ever felt honest. One evening, a transport ship arrived, carrying supplies, or so we thought. Instead, it unloaded rows of coffins. The priest who accompanied them explained they contained the bodies of those who died on neighboring worlds, each one a testament to the Emperor's endless faith. He said, "We were ordered to carry the coffins into the catacombs for cremation. The weight of them was unbearable, not for the mass, but for what they represented. The coffins weren't sealed. Inside each one was a child. Some still had their Schola uniforms. Some still clutched training manuals in their stiff hands. Their faces looked like ours. I don't remember dropping the coffin. I just remember the sound it made when it hit the ground. The sound of victory hollowing out whatever remained of belief. That night, I couldn't sleep. The neural chip whispered the catechism in my ear, but the words blurred into static. I turned my face to the ceiling and whispered the only thing I still could. Who remembers us? No answer. Just the low hum of the manufactorum. The same mechanical breath that had cradled me since birth. The next morning, the sky burned red again. Another uprising, another cleansing declared. New orders came through the Vox. We packed our gear without question. We had learned by then that questioning was just another way of dying. As the transport engines roared to life, I glanced back one last time at the field where we'd buried the children. The wind had blown the ashes into patterns, swirls that almost looked like wings. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. Either way, the thought followed me as we rose into orbit. In the Imperium, victory doesn't raise monuments. It buries them. War begins long before the first shot is fired. It starts with the silence before the sirens, the breath before the scream. Our transport broke through the upper atmosphere of a world whose name I never learned. The officers called it a cleansing theater. The Vox channels simply labeled it designation, Secundus Helion. The landscape below was a furnace continents of red dust, rivers of molten iron, and clouds that glowed with static fire. The air itself looked angry. We were told the planet had once been prosperous, rich in minerals. Then came rebellion. Then came the cleansing. Then came us. We were barely 15. The ship's hold smelled of sweat, promethium, and fear, 3 scents that define a soldier's life. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, laskins clutched like rosaries. The neural catechisms whispered in our skulls, looping endlessly. Obedience is survival. Faith is function. The Emperor knows your name. But I didn't believe he did. Not anymore. The ramp dropped. The wind hit us like a wall, hot, metallic, dry enough to tear your throat. The sky burned orange from constant bombardment. In the distance, artillery fire rolled like thunder. Sergeant Hask was there, still alive, still impossible. His voice tore through the Vox link. Formation. Line, move. We moved because that's what obedience is, motion without thought. The ground was littered with bones and shell casings. The bones were black, fused into the rock like fossils of despair. The air reeked of ozone and scorched flesh. I could feel the ash grinding between my teeth. Our orders were simple. Secure the manufactorum ruins and await reinforcements. No one asked from where those reinforcements would come. The galaxy is full of orders, but almost empty of answers. We marched across the plains in silence. The youngest among us, barely taller than their rifles, kept glancing at the horizon, as if expecting salvation to descend from orbit. I didn't tell them what I already knew. Salvation doesn't descend. It demands ascent, and few of us ever made it high enough. The first attack came at dusk. The enemy wasn't Xenos or heretic, just other humans who had stopped kneeling. Their uniforms were torn, their armor painted with defaced aquilus. Their faces looked like ours. Children grown too fast, eyes too old. When the shooting started, training replaced thought. The air filled with red beams and screams. The sound of lost fire isn't like thunder. It's more like glass breaking, over and over, until your mind stops recognizing it as sound. We fired until the barrels glowed. We fired because stopping meant dying. I remember the smell of burnt ozone mixing with blood, the taste of iron in the air, the way the sky flickered as if the planet itself were blinking, and then silence. Not victory, not peace, just the absence of noise. I turned and saw one of ours lying face down in the dust. A boy named Kalen. He'd been in my training unit back on Orpheon. The same boy who once drew stars on the walls before they broke his fingers. He was staring at the sky now, unblinking. The brands on his shoulders were still glowing faintly. The flesh burned deeper by the heat. For a moment, I almost envied him. Night fell. We dug in among the ruins, setting up perimeter charges while the servitors dragged the dead into piles. The chaplain arrived to recite the litany of valor. His voice was hollow, filtered through a vox grill. Their blood is the Emperor's ink. Their deaths write his will. The wind howled through the manufactorum skeleton, carrying the screams of things that might have been human once. We slept in our armor, rifles in our hands. I dreamed of a classroom with no walls and a teacher made of fire. At dawn, new orders came through the Vox. Advance to Grid 9 Theta. Reinforcements delayed. That word meant doomed. By midday, half the squad was gone. Hask still barked commands, but his voice was fading, worn thin by the static and the heat. The youngest of us, the ones they still called initiates, were now carrying the wounded, instead of their rifles. The Medicae units had been destroyed hours earlier. When the second wave hit, we had no warning. Mortar fire rained from the clouds, tearing through the ground like the wrath of forgotten gods. One shell landed close enough to throw me off my feet. The world spun, colors bleeding together into a smear of red and white. When I woke, there was no sky, only dust and smoke. My ears rang like cracked bells. I tried to move, but something heavy pinned my legs to corpse. His face was gone, replaced by a melted aquila plate. All around me, the catechism still whispered through the neural implant, endure, serve, be silent. But the voice had changed. It sounded afraid. Through the haze, I saw movement. A child, no older than 12, crawling toward me. His uniform was torn, his eyes wide and hollow. He was one of ours, or maybe one of theirs. At that point, there was no difference. He reached out, his lips trembling. Help, he said. I reached back. For a heartbeat, I thought the Emperor himself might forgive us for what we'd become. Then a bolt round struck him. The impact tore him apart in a spray of red mist. The commissar walked past without looking down. Mercy is heresy, he said, reloading his pistol. That was the day I stopped believing in salvation. When night fell again, the stars came out cold, distant, perfect. I realized most of us would never reach them, never even know their names. We were the forgotten children of forgotten worlds, buried beneath wars that never ended. The next morning, we were ordered to retreat, not because the battle was lost, but because there was nothing left to win. The manufactorum had been destroyed, the rebels scattered, the planet poisoned. Victory. By imperial measure. We boarded the transports in silence, stepping over piles of ash that had once been men. As the ship lifted off, I looked back at the burning world below. The Vox still whispered the same words in my ear, a prayer on repeat. The Emperor protects. But all I could think was, protects who? Because on that world, and in 1,000 others like it, the Emperor's children learned the truth. We were not his flock. We were his fuel. The first thing you learn about imperial education is that it isn't meant to teach. It's meant to erase. By the time I was 14, my squad had been transferred to the Schola Militaris Orphean, a fortress academy carved into the side of a dead mountain. From orbit, it must have looked like a scar, a wound that never healed. From the ground, it was worse. Towers of basalt rose like black teeth, cutting through the fog. The banners of the Imperium hung limp against the wind, each one frayed at the edges, bleeding ash. The instructors called it the fires of education. Not metaphorically. Every morning, the sirens screamed at 0400, the dormitory lights flashed crimson, and the loudspeakers recited the catechism of the flame. Ignorance is weakness. Knowledge is duty. The Emperor burns away both. We filed into the courtyard barefoot, the ground freezing beneath our feet. The cold bit deep, but no one flinched. Flinching was noticed, and being noticed meant punishment. A line of servitors stood at the edge of the yard, carrying brands heated white-hot in promethium flames. They smelled of oil, blood, and machine-burnt hair. Each brand bore a single sigil, the mark of our unit. The ceremony was called the binding of loyalty. When my turn came, a sister of the Ordos Ministorum pressed the iron against my shoulder. The pain was pure light. I didn't scream, not because of courage, but because the boy before me had, and they'd taken him away. The scar never healed right. Even now, years later, it throbs when I hear him chant or smell promethium. After branding came the lectures, if you could call them that. They weren't about history or strategy. They were about faith through obedience. We were told about the heretics who questioned orders, the mutants who thought too freely, The worlds that died because one voice spoke without permission. Every desk had a listening node. If you whispered something forbidden, it logged your words and printed them onto a slip of parchment for review. We called it the sin paper. I still remember watching a girl named Eline dragged from her seat. When her node printed the word "why," nothing more, just why. No one ever saw her again. Between sessions, we trained. The Schola had no play fields, only obstacle courses littered with spent casings and old bones. The instructor said the bones belonged to martyrs who had failed their exams. We believed them. Belief was safer than doubt. We were taught to strip and reassemble Alaskan blindfolded, to march until our feet bled, to aim without mercy. When the recoil bruised our shoulders, the instructor said, "That is the Emperor reminding you of your weakness." At night, we prayed in silence. The dorms were dark except for the faint glow of the aquila carved into the far wall, lit by a single candle that never went out. We didn't know if it was holy oil or just machine-fed fire. It didn't matter. The symbol was eternal. That was enough. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I'd hear whispers in the walls. Not the catechisms, not the neural implants. Real voices. Children reciting lessons in tones too soft to be mechanical. I once followed the sound to a locked storage room. Through a crack in the door, I saw dozens of small data slates stacked like tombstones, each engraved with a name. The whispers came from them. Recorded lessons, looping forever. They weren't lessons for us. They were echoes of those who hadn't survived to finish them. I began to realize that the Schola didn't train soldiers. It manufactured memories. It took in fear, pain, and loss, and printed out discipline. But even within that machine, something human lingered. There was a boy named Taran, older than me by a year, stronger, sharper, but not yet broken. He would sneak pieces of rationed bread from the mess and leave them in the chapel. For anyone too weak to stand through prayer. It was dangerous. Compassion always was. One night, I found him sitting by the statue of St. Drusus, his hands shaking. "Why do you do it?" I asked. He looked up. His eyes were hollow but alive. "Because someone did it for me," he said. Before the fire, a week later, he was gone. The instructor said he'd been selected for advanced indoctrination. That was the phrase they used for disappearances. We all knew what it meant. The fires of education had found new kindling. After that, no one shared food again. The Schola's final test came during the siege drill. We were marched into a hollowed cavern beneath the fortress, a mock battlefield of sand, iron, and real corpses. They told us it was to prepare us for the front. The instructors wore masks of gold, their voices echoing like gods. Victory is faith. Mercy is treason. They released us into the field in teams of 5. Our task, eliminate the enemy. They didn't tell us who the enemy was. The first time we saw movement in the dust, we fired without thinking. When the smoke cleared, I saw the truth. The enemy had been another team. Children like us, marked with different sigils. One of them was still alive. A girl, barely 12, clutching her laskin with trembling hands. She looked at me and whispered, "Please." The instructors watched from above, silent, waiting. I hesitated. For the first time in years, I hesitated. The others didn't. The gunfire drowned her voice. After the exercise, they lined us up again. "Hesitation is corruption," said the sister. "Mercy is contagion." They branded my other shoulder. That night, I sat awake, unable to sleep. The whispers in my head, the endless sermons of the neural chip, grew louder, angrier, almost desperate. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it didn't stop. I realized then that the voice wasn't the Emperor's. It was ours. The collective guilt of 1,000 children burned into obedience, echoing back from the machine. By the time dawn came, the Schola bells rang not for prayer, but for transport. We were being deployed. The instructor smiled, "A rare, terrible thing. Your education is complete," one of them said. "You will serve the Emperor now, or you will die trying. Both are success." We boarded the transport ships in silence. None of us spoke. None of us looked back. As the engines roared, I caught my reflection in the metal wall. The face of someone who used to be a child. The brand on my shoulder still glowed faintly, the flesh pulsing like it remembered something I didn't. Somewhere deep in the fortress, I thought I heard the data slates whisper again. The voices of all those who never made it past the fires. "Forget who you were," they murmured. "The Emperor remembers enough for all of us." The ship broke through the clouds, leaving the dead mountain behind. I felt the weight of gravity fade, replaced by something worse. The realization that we were no longer children of any world. We were children of war now, and war has no age. The first lesson they teach you after conscription is how to stand still. Stillness, they say, is the emperor's posture. A soldier who fidgets cannot hear his will. We were lined up in rows across the ship's training deck, 1,000 children in identical gray fatigues. The air smelled of oil and fear. The instructors, veterans of a dozen forgotten wars, moved through the ranks like machines, their augmetic eyes clicking, measuring, judging. Discipline is purity, barked Sergeant Hask. Purity is survival. Those who failed to stand straight were struck with the electrobaton until they learned the rhythm of obedience. I learned quickly. Pain was a tutor far kinder than hunger. The voyage lasted months. The ship's windows were sealed. We never saw the stars. Rumors said we were headed to Cadia, or maybe to a world whose name had been burned away by war. It didn't matter. The Imperium's wars are all the same, only the corpses change. Every morning began with prayer. We knelt on cold steel while a servo chaplain broadcast the litanies of endurance through vox grilles above our heads. His voice was mechanical, devoid of mercy. We were told to imagine the Emperor watching through the ship's cameras. The idea that he might see us kept most from sleeping at all. When one boy, Ren, asked what the Emperor looked like, Hask struck him so hard his lip split. "The Emperor looks like whatever kills you," he said. Ren never asked again. Meals were issued through dispensers, flavorless nutrient paste flavored faintly with copper. We ate in silence under the watch of servitors that recorded every motion. Even chewing too slowly was marked as inefficiency. After the prayers came the drills. Marching, shooting, recitation. We memorized the creeds before we learned tactics. Every weapon had a prayer, every magazine, a blessing. To fail a verse was to forfeit supper. One night, the boy in the bunk beside me whispered, "Do you think he can hear us out here?" I told him to sleep. Faith wasn't a question. It was a uniform. You wore it, or you died. When we finally reached the planet, the air burned like acid. The world was nameless, designated only by numbers on the ship's manifest. K-472, Class World Delta, Infantry Foundry. The sky was orange with ash. Towers of black stone rose from the plains, each capped with the sigil of the Astra Militarum. We were herded down ramps into a fortress that smelled of blood and disinfectant. Here, the children of the Imperium became its soldiers. The first weeks blurred into one long scream. Vaccination, gene testing, implantation of the neural catechism chip, a sliver of steel placed behind the ear that whispered the Emperor's creed directly into the mind. The whisper never stopped. At night, when the drills ended, we lay in our bunks trembling, our ears ringing with prayers that weren't our own. Some tried to scratch the chips out. They were taken away. The next morning, their beds were gone too. They told us that emotion was a disease. Fear could be treated with obedience. Doubt could be burned away by faith. But nothing cured memory. During target practice, I sometimes saw flashes my mother's face. The hum of the manufactorum. The girl who used to sing. The instructors called such visions weakness. "You remember the wrong things," Hask said. "Forget what you were. Be what you are made to be." By the time we were 13, we could field strip Alaskan in 7 seconds, recite every verse of the Catechism of War, and shoot without hesitation. Our reward was a new uniform, black with red trim, stitched with the aquila over the heart. The symbol was supposed to inspire pride. To me, it felt like a brand. Occasionally, commissars would visit, towering in their greatcoats, eyes like cold fire. They inspected us as if choosing livestock. Once, a boy fainted during inspection. The commissar didn't even speak. He drew his bolt pistol and fired. The sound was deafening in the hall. We were ordered to continue standing. No one cried. Crying would have been noise, and noise was rebellion. I learned to march, to kill, to thank the Emperor for both. I learned to strip away thought until only action remained. The instructor said we were becoming soldiers. But deep down, I knew we were becoming something less, flesh, components of a machine too vast to comprehend. Sometimes, during the rare moments of rest, I'd stare at the cracked ceiling of the barracks and imagine what lay beyond the clouds. I'd picture the stars we'd never see, the worlds we'd never touch, and I'd wonder if there were other children somewhere, praying to the same indifferent light. One night, the neural whisper in my skull changed tone. Instead of scripture, it spoke a single phrase, faint but clear: "Endure, and you will be remembered." It wasn't the Emperor's voice. I don't know whose it was, but I clung to it like a secret. When dawn came, we assembled again on the drill field. The chaplain's servo skull hovered above, dripping holy oil onto our heads. "You are weapons of his will," it intoned. "You will die nameless, and that is glory." The boy beside me whispered, Then why do we still have names? I didn't answer, because I already knew the truth. Names were not for us, they were for the record keepers, so that when we died, the machine could count how many prayers have been fulfilled. The next day, Ren disappeared. His bed was empty. The instructor said he had been promoted to service, but we all knew promotion only ever meant one thing from then on. No one spoke without permission. We became perfect, silent, efficient, holy. And somewhere deep within that silence, I realized what obedience really was. Not faith, not loyalty, not fear. It was the surrender of the right to remember who you were before the orders began. There is no word for childhood in High Gothic. The Imperium has words for lineage, for duty, for sacrifice, but none for innocence. To be born under the light of the Astronomicon is not to live. It is to begin owing. In the underhives of Necromunda, the air itself feels like inheritance. You come screaming into a world already choking. The Medicae servitors don't cradle you. They skin you, measure your bones, stamp your gene tag into a file that will follow you until the day you die, which, for most, comes before adulthood. I was born beneath a manufactorum spire. My first lullaby was the hum of machinery and the hiss of promethium vents. My mother used to tell me that the sound meant the Emperor was breathing through the walls, keeping us warm. But even as a child I knew it was the sound of hunger. The engines never stopped because they couldn't afford to. Our block overseer told us once that every cry of a newborn meant one more ration card cut in half. The Emperor provides, he said, but he does not provide twice. So we learned early to cry quietly. In the Scholum, they taught us to read the Imperial Creed before we learned to write our names. We recited the canticles of obedience until our throats bled. There were no toys, only relics, shards of broken aquilus passed from one generation to the next. We were told they had belonged to heroes. Sometimes I wondered if the heroes had been as hungry as we were. The first time I saw sunlight was when I was 7. The overseers marched us to the upper platforms to witness the Feast of Ascension. From that high, the light looked like fire filtered through smoke. The nobles stood on a golden dais, their robes shimmering with incense-scented dust. They spoke of the Emperor's love. We stood barefoot on rusted metal, breathing the fumes of their celebration. I remember one of the nobles, a woman with eyes like polished glass. She looked down at us and smiled as if we were sacred curiosities. Later I would learn her smile meant quotas had been met. Enough of us had survived the season to fill the labor ranks. Back in the dormitories, the older children whispered about the black ships. They said the Emperor's hunters came in the night to take away those who dreamed too brightly. I used to lie awake, praying to dream of nothing. But sometimes, in that half-sleep where the vents groaned like distant beasts, I'd see colors that didn't exist in the waking world. Gold that bled, stars that wept. I never told anyone. At 9, we began work rotation. The older children handled assembly lines. The younger ones scrubbed vents or carried waste. The heat from the manufactorum burned our skin raw. But we were told pain was proof of faith. The Medicae smeared us with recycled salve made from rendered tallow. Blessed are those who blister, they said. Once a month, the Ministorum priests visited. They wore masks of bronze and carried censers that filled the air with choking incense. They told us we were fortunate, that on other worlds, children were fed to the Astra Militarum as conscripts, or given to the black ships for tithe. Here, they said, you serve in comfort. Comfort meant surviving long enough to reach 12. Those who didn't were recycled. Bones for fertilizer, blood for pigment, bodies burned to feed the manufacturum's reactors. Nothing wasted, not even failure. One boy, Kalen, used to draw on the walls with soot. He sketched stars, cities, things we'd never seen. When the overseer caught him, he broke Kalen's fingers and ordered the servitors to clean the wall. Art is for saints, he said, not for property. I still remember the sound of those bones snapping. It was the sound of hope being measured, priced, and denied. Sometimes the air recyclers failed, and the dorms filled with smoke. We'd lie awake, coughing, listening to the sermons blaring from the Vox speakers. Obedience is survival. Survival is service. Service is love. The voice never tired. It was said to belong to a saint, long dead, his words kept alive by machine spirits. When the work alarms sounded at dawn, we rose without question. Questioning was rebellion. Rebellion was sin. Sin was death. Those were the first commandments we learned, the only ones that mattered. But even within the machine, there were moments that felt almost human. A girl named Serene used to sing while she worked, fragments of old lullabies passed down, before records were lost. Her voice was soft, broken by the rhythm of the conveyors. But when she sang, the world seemed almost bearable. One day she was gone. Rumor said she'd been chosen for the Schola Progenium, the orphan academies that raised future commissars and clerics. Others said she'd been sent to the mines. Both were probably true. In their own way, I kept a piece of her song in my head, repeating it when the noise of the machinery became too loud. When I turned 12, the Adeptus Administratum sent assessors. They carried data slates glowing with names and scores. Each of us was measured, weighed, and assigned a future: servitor, laborer, soldier, or sacrifice. I was marked for transit. The seal bore the sigil of the Astra Militarum. My mother wept, but only briefly. Tears were rationed like everything else. They told me I was going to serve the Emperor among the stars. They told me it was an honor. But when the transport door sealed and the lights dimmed, I realized service was just another word for disappearance. The ship's engines roared, drowning out everything but prayer. Around me, dozens of children sat in silence, each clutching the same small token: a strip of cloth, a fragment of metal, a whisper of home. I held nothing, because by then, I had already learned the first and last truth of our kind. In the Imperium, children are not raised, they are forged, and those who survive long enough to grow old do not remember what they were, only what they became.